There are people in this world who seem to carry more than their fair share of the world's pain. People who, from the very moment they arrive, are handed burdens that most of us would struggle to understand, let alone survive. Tyler Henry is one of those people. To millions of television viewers across America, he is the calm, soft-spoken young man who sits across from crying celebrities and delivers messages that seem to come from somewhere beyond ordinary understanding. He is the boy who grew up in a small California town and somehow ended up in the living rooms of the most famous people in Hollywood, holding their hands while they wept over mothers, fathers, and siblings they had lost. He became a television star before he was old enough to rent a car. He built a waiting list of hundreds of thousands of people desperate for just a few minutes of his time. He wrote books, performed sold-out live shows, and starred in a Netflix documentary series that left audiences around the world completely shaken. From the outside, the story of Tyler Henry looks like one of the most remarkable success stories of his generation. But here is what most people never stop to consider. Behind every reading Tyler Henry has ever delivered, behind every tear he has ever helped someone release, behind every moment of closure he has provided to a grieving stranger, there's a young man who has spent nearly every single year of his 29 years on this earth fighting through pain that most of us will never fully understand. There is a young man who predicted death before he understood what death truly meant. There is a young man who lost his first love and spent years carrying guilt over a decision he made as a frightened teenager. There is a young man who discovered that the woman he called grandmother was not who she claimed to be, and that the truth hiding underneath that lie was something so dark it seemed almost impossible to believe. There is a young man whose body has been opened up by surgeons multiple times, whose lungs collapsed without warning, and who has faced death not in the spiritual, abstract sense that defines his career, but in the most terrifyingly literal sense imaginable. The real story of Tyler Henry is not the one that plays out under studio lights. It is the story of a human being who has lived through an almost unimaginable sequence of tragedy, loss, illness, and revelation, and who has somehow continued standing. That story deserves to be told fully and honestly, not because it makes for dramatic television, but because it reveals something profound about what it actually costs a person to spend their life serving as a bridge between the living and the dead. Tyler Henry Collowan was born on January 13, 1996, in Hanford, California, a small agricultural city in the San Joaquin Valley. From the very beginning, his arrival into the world was complicated. He was born prematurely, and doctors discovered almost immediately that he had a brain cyst, a fluid-filled sac nestled inside his developing brain that would quietly sit there throughout his childhood, waiting. His parents, Teresa and David Collowan, brought him home to a modest household in a conservative community where life moved slowly and expectations were relatively simple. Tyler was an only child, and by most outward appearances, his early years were unremarkable. He went to school. He came home. He sat at family dinners. He watched the seasons change over the flat valley landscape the way all small-town children do, with that particular mixture of comfort and quiet restlessness. But something was different about Tyler from the very beginning, and it became impossible to ignore when he was approximately 10 years old. One morning, he woke up with a feeling unlike anything he had experienced before. It was not a dream he was trying to remember. It was not anxiety or a stomach ache or any ordinary childhood worry. It was something that he would later describe as a sudden, overwhelming certainty that something terrible was about to happen to someone in his family. The feeling was so strong and so specific that he could not keep it to himself. He went to his mother, Teresa, and told her directly that he believed his grandmother was going to die. Teresa did not know how to respond to that. What mother knows how to respond to something like that? She assumed her son was frightened by something he did not understand, perhaps a dream he was misremembering or an overheard conversation he had misinterpreted. She tried to reassure him and move past the moment. Then the phone rang. Tyler's father was on the other end of the line. His grandmother had just collapsed and died. The timing between Tyler's words and that phone call was so immediate, so precise, that Teresa could not simply explain it away. And for Tyler, standing in that moment at 10 years old, there was nothing empowering about being right. There was nothing that felt like a gift. What he felt was terror. He had not wanted to know something like that. He had not asked for that knowledge to appear in his mind. And yet it had arrived anyway, and it had been true, and now his grandmother was gone, and something had permanently shifted inside the quiet routine of his childhood. That single moment cracked open a door that would never fully close again, and the rest of Tyler Henry's life has essentially been the story of what came rushing through it. Over the years that followed, the experiences continued. They were not constant at first, but they were persistent enough that Tyler could not pretend they were not happening. He began noticing that he sometimes picked up emotional impressions from people he had just met. He would occasionally describe specific details about someone's deceased relative without having been told anything about that person. He would sometimes simply know things in the way he had known about his grandmother, with that same quality of sudden, inexplicable certainty. For a while, he kept these experiences mostly private, confiding in very few people because he genuinely did not know what they meant or whether anyone would believe him. But as he entered his teenage years, keeping quiet became increasingly difficult. Word began spreading through his community in Hanford that there was a boy who seemed to know things he should not know. Some people were curious. Some people were skeptical. And some people, particularly in the conservative Christian community, where Tyler was growing up, were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a young person claiming to communicate with those who had passed on. In certain corners of that community, what Tyler described was not a gift. It was a source of suspicion, and sometimes something darker than that. High school became one of the most painful chapters of Tyler's life. The qualities that made him unusual also made him a target. Some classmates avoided him entirely, not wanting to be associated with the teenager who talked about dead people. Others mocked him openly, deciding that he was either lying for attention or genuinely strange in a way that marked him as someone to stay away from. The isolation was real, and it was daily. Tyler has spoken about those years with a directness that makes it clear the pain went deep. He was not simply a quirky kid who did not quite fit in. He was someone who was genuinely alone during years when loneliness feels most unbearable, trying to make sense of an ability he had never asked for while simultaneously navigating the ordinary cruelties of adolescence. And then, somewhere inside that already difficult period, came the experience that would leave the deepest mark of all. During his teenage years, Tyler formed a close and deeply meaningful friendship with a boy named Terry. What began as friendship grew into something more significant. Tyler has described Terry as his first love, the person with whom he experienced for the first time what it felt like to be truly, emotionally close to another human being. For a teenager who had spent much of his social life feeling like an outsider, that connection was not small. It was enormous. It was the kind of bond that reminds a lonely young person that they are capable of being known and loved, and that reminder matters in ways that are difficult to overstate. But even as that relationship was deepening, Tyler began having a premonition that he could not shake. He started receiving impressions suggesting that Terry's childhood brain cancer, which had previously been treated, was going to come back. The feeling grew stronger over time rather than fading, and Tyler found himself trapped in a position that no teenager should ever have to occupy. He was carrying what he believed to be foreknowledge of a terrible thing that was going to happen to someone he loved, and he had no idea what to do with it. In the end, he made the decision that fear so often drives people toward. Instead of staying close to Terry and facing whatever was coming, Tyler began slowly distancing himself. He pulled away from the relationship, telling himself that it would hurt less if he was not as close to Terry when the worst happened. He has been remarkably honest in later years about what that decision actually was. It was not wisdom. It was not a spiritually informed choice. It was a frightened teenager trying to protect himself from unbearable pain by creating distance, not understanding that the distance itself would become its own unbearable pain. Terry's cancer returned. He died before reaching adulthood. Tyler was left with not just the grief of losing his first love, but with a guilt that burrowed into him and stayed there for years. He had pushed away someone he loved during what turned out to be the final chapter of that person's life. Whatever his reasons, whatever fear had driven the decision, the result was that he had not been there. And no amount of spiritual insight, no number of readings delivered to grieving strangers, no television appearances or critical acclaim could simply erase that. The guilt from those years followed Tyler Henry into adulthood and into fame, a constant reminder that the ability he carried could not protect the people closest to him from loss, and sometimes it could not even protect him from causing harm through his own frightened choices. By the time Tyler was 16 and 17, he had begun giving readings regularly to members of his community. His reputation had grown beyond Hanford, spreading through word of mouth to people across California who were curious about the teenager with the unusual ability. He was performing readings almost every day, driven partly by a genuine desire to help people and partly, one suspects, by the simple fact that helping others gave some structure and purpose to an ability that had otherwise brought him mostly confusion and pain. That expanding reputation eventually reached the entertainment industry, which has always had an appetite for stories that cannot be easily explained. Tyler received his first major national exposure through an appearance on Keeping Up with the Kardashians, during which he conducted a reading for members of the family connected to the memory of their late father, Robert Kardashian Sr. The emotional resonance of that appearance spread rapidly across the internet, and suddenly millions of people who had never heard of a teenager from Hanford, California, were watching closely and asking questions. The E! Network offered Tyler his own show. Hollywood Medium with Tyler Henry premiered when Tyler was just 19 years old. The concept was straightforward but emotionally powerful. Tyler would meet with celebrities, conduct readings, and deliver whatever impressions or messages he believed were coming through from those who had passed. The show was an immediate cultural phenomenon. Celebrities from across the entertainment world sat across from the calm, young man with his notebook and his quiet intensity. Some came out of genuine curiosity. Some came because grief had left them searching for something they could not find anywhere else. Some came as skeptics and left visibly shaken. The show produced moments that became embedded in the public conversation about life, death, and what, if anything, lies beyond. He warned Megan Fox about serious challenges approaching in her personal life. He helped Jaleel White revisit painful memories connected to the loss of his former co-star Michelle Thomas. He sat with figures from music, film, and television and delivered information that their handlers, publicists, and closest friends confirmed they had never provided to him or anyone connected to the production. The waiting list for private readings with Tyler exploded to numbers that seemed almost surreal. By some accounts, it eventually reached close to 500,000 names. Fame arrived fast, and it arrived heavy. Tyler was 19, 20, 21 years old, and he was being asked to carry the grief of celebrities, of television audiences, and of the hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who wrote to him desperately hoping for a chance to hear from someone they had lost. Most people his age were figuring out how to live on their own for the first time, learning to cook and do laundry, and navigate the social landscape of early adulthood. Tyler was sitting across from people in some of the most vulnerable moments of their lives, responsible for managing their grief, their hope, their despair, and their healing, all while the cameras rolled, and the public watched, and the skeptics waited for him to make a mistake. Because the skeptics were always there. They have always been part of Tyler Henry's life, and fame did not reduce their presence. It amplified it enormously. The controversy surrounding psychic mediums is not new, and Tyler has always acknowledged that skepticism is a reasonable response to what he does. What he perhaps did not fully anticipate was the sheer volume and intensity of criticism that would follow his every public appearance once he became nationally famous. Critics examined his readings frame by frame, looking for evidence of cold reading techniques, the practice of making broad statements, and using a subject's reactions to guide increasingly specific claims. Others suggested that production teams might research subjects in advance, providing Tyler with information that could make his readings appear more accurate than they actually were. Skeptical communities online dedicated significant energy to pulling apart his sessions and offering alternative explanations for every moment that struck his supporters as genuinely inexplicable. Some of the criticism was intellectually honest and came from a place of genuine inquiry. Some of it was vicious and personal, accusing Tyler of deliberately exploiting grieving people for financial gain. What made the skepticism particularly sharp was the nature of his audience. People who sought out Tyler Henry were almost always people in pain. They had lost parents, children, partners, siblings, and closest friends. They were desperate for connection, for reassurance, for one more chance to say or hear something that death had interrupted. Critics argued that offering false hope to people in that condition was not merely a harmless entertainment choice. It was, in their view, a form of exploitation regardless of whether Tyler believed in what he was doing. Tyler has navigated that criticism with a composure that seems genuinely hard-won rather than simply performative. He does not claim that his abilities can be scientifically proven. He does not insist that everyone must believe what he experiences is real. He describes what he perceives, acknowledges that others will interpret it differently, and continues the work. Whether one believes in what he does or not, the composure itself tells a story about a person who learned very young that not everyone would accept him, and who found a way to keep going anyway. Then came the discovery that shook Tyler's understanding of his own family to its foundation. For his Netflix documentary series Life After Death with Tyler Henry, Tyler turned his abilities toward his own family history in a way he had never done publicly before. The investigation began when his mother, Teresa, took a consumer DNA test out of curiosity. The results that came back were not what anyone expected. The biological connection that Teresa had always assumed existed between herself and the woman who raised her was simply not there. The woman Tyler had grown up knowing as his maternal grandmother was not biologically related to his mother at all. As the family began pulling on that thread, the full picture that emerged was genuinely shocking. Teresa had apparently been taken from a hospital as a newborn by the woman who would raise her, a woman who falsified records and constructed an entirely fictional family history around a child she had stolen. The biological family Teresa actually came from had existed all along, unknown and unreachable, separated from her by a deliberate and sustained deception that lasted for decades.